It was a curious thing to look upon a world that shared a name with his venerable homeland and witness the manifold differences. Old Albion of Terra was a harsh place. Skies ever filled with the choking black smoke belched from the iron keeps and lands stiff with freezing colds. A bare land tormented by the black grasp of the arch-tyrant that held sway for so long. Their cousin legion, the Dusk Raiders, were spiteful enough to put it at the forefront of their minds with their blood-red gauntlets. The younger Battle Brothers only knew from stories, but the oldest veterans of the Stormwalkers knew well the harsh truth. Even with his defeat nearly half a century ago, the red right hand of Magna Albia had permanently warped all who dwelt in their homeland. There was nothing that his malignant grasp did not touch, and the choking air of industry and war had left all of them changed. There was nothing left for their generation in Old Albion, a generation warped by war, pain, and iron. The generation that came after them would be gentler, and with time, Albion might return to a gentle land. The warbands who had known the rule of the Black King were best served being put to war elsewhere, far from their venerable homelands, and used until they died. It was why he had bent the knee when the Emperor had properly arrived, and told them his dream. Because it was his dream as well. A host of their greatest warriors, their Ironside soldiery and rumbling war coffins, arrayed to create a killing field in the frozen ashlands. A giant, bereft of arms and armor, clad in robes of red and white, voice rolling with distant thunder and the light of a sun crowning his brow. A heavy brow, one that understood. I seek a time in which warriors such as we are far from our homelands. Pew s, pew, pew r, jot, pew, 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 two blot s, pew, pew jew, motu, safeguarded for 1,000 void leagues in every direction, and the horrors of war far from our peoples. I seek to push back the endless night to the edges of all known space, where warriors such as we hold back the darkness with a great wall of steel and fire. I seek unification for mankind, and glory on battlefields ever distant from what I seek to protect. Bruce, tell me, honored warriors of Iron Albion, do you not seek the same? 'Twas even decades from that day that memory was wrought into his mind with perfect clarity. It was something that he could not forget, even if he wished to. And so Amadeus Duquesne, warlord of the Duquesne, had bent the knee to the Golden King. In doing so, he was taken and reforged into an ever more lethal weapon and warrior, an Astartes, and made Lord Commander over one of the 20 grand legions of men now like him. The Great Crusade was launched shortly after. Old Albion was one of the last holdouts of resistance on ancient Terra, and with their oaths of loyalty it was soon time to move on. First, to purge a mutant warband on Terra, a minor test of their new capacity before leaving to the stars. Then to purge yet more mutants who dwelt on Baal, in preparation to receive one of the Emperor's daughters to yet arrive. They had met their primarchs soon enough, gene mother and origin of their new strength, daughter of the Emperor and nigh demigod in capacity. Lady Athena was harsh and unkind, but not cruel of intent or deed. Her mind was clever, and her presence was dominating, clearly suited for war and duty. She would be a fine war queen, in time. She was young yet, despite her great stature, as were all of the Emperor's daughters. They had time to grow and learn, and he was confident in the abilities he had seen of her thus far. Then they had been deployed, all warriors of the Emperor's fleet, to purge a planet known as Barbarous. It was a reminder to those of old Albion that hope was a fleeting and foolish thing, and that no matter their strength, they could always be brought low. 1,000 of their number dead against horrors that seemed without end, with mere presence seeming to kill hope and bring ruinous despair. Fiends of bodies that should be frail with disease and limb rot, but belied an immense and unnatural strength in arms and resilience to their lighter cannons. In those moments, it felt like he was facing the hollow knights of dread, Coudenbaith once more, and he roared orders instinctively. Mind returning to those black-clad spectres and their wicked poisoned blades, greatest servants of the once arch-tyrant that they would soon bring low. 10,000 of their number wounded, limbs struck with poisoned and rotting magics, quickly amputated on the battlefield, relying on the quick clotting of their new superhuman bodies to keep them firing from a distance. Those quick amputations as policy had saved many from outright death, but had ensured that the Stormwalkers now had the most artificial limbs of any legion. It was an almost nostalgic experience, looking upon so many of his men in cramped medical facilities, metal limbs in the process of being fitted to their flesh to replace what was lost on a cold and choking battlefield. And now he stood upon a planet, far from Terra, in a realm that shared a name with his venerable homeland. Albion they called the domain of their High King. He looked about at their ever-busy construction efforts, escorted by his honor guard. He looked at their keeps and people, at their domains and their domiciles, at their lands and their labors. This land was fair, its people kind, and war far from them. He looked upon the statue of their High King, supposedly an exact replica of his true appearance in both scale and painted hues, hands resting on a great golden blade that was nigh identical to the Emperor's own. Robo-Te was his name. I Kill Evil was his battle name. His right gauntlet was red, his features fair, his eyes blue, his hair white, gold. Hues of southern Albion. Had his armor been painted black and silver? Had he been wearing a visored helm? Had he bore a mantle of shadows and sword of evil? Amadeus would have mistaken him for the Black King himself, for that lord who turned barbarian clans into a nation of brutal iron and choking industry. He looked down to read the speech carved into the foot of the statue, to read the last lines once more, at the bottom of the statue's base. Tell me, people of my new capital. Tell me, people of Baston, will you give unto me this? Do you dream of brother stars and united kingdoms? Do you dream of silver that might one day be gold? Tell me, people of Albion, do you share my dream? He remembered the last words of the unspeakable king and the cold steel glare in those shadowed eyes, a rumbling growl behind a steel-visored helm. The last words of a man who tormented many, and a man that he had ended with his own heavy hammer. A corpse he had watched dissolve into liquid dust. Our ability to destroy will always outstrip our ability to create, such is our curse and salvation. Our end, when it comes, will be writ by our own bloody hand. He had yet to come to a proper conclusion of all the truths he beheld. In the end, it was not his place, he supposed. The burden of judgment was upon the Emperor, the Golden King that the warriors of Albion had put their faith into. They had only need to withstand whatever hell he led them into, so that all who stood behind them would not need to. These hands of rusted iron would wrestle death away from their people. They were still strong enough to. He removed one cold, heavy limb from the head of his warhammer and took it up as a near cane once more. Turning his head to his honor guard, he commanded, I am done here. Tell the 5th Company they have my leave to begin their period of leave. They are still to obey all commandments of appropriate behavior. Aye, Lord Duquesne. The partially synthetic voice of veteran Macduff responded, throat nicked out by a wicked blade on Barbarous, only saved by his own quick response to reach up and tear his own throat out. He barely survived long enough to be evacuated and treated, and a replacement was quickly given to him. Curious, isn't this? He nodded, well aware of what old Macduff was referring to. Aye, so what do you think, Stormbringer? Another honor guard spoke up, veteran Gregor, voice heavy with age, but light with experienced amusement. Shoulders heavy with additional firearms mounted but currently offline. Are we on the foothills of silvery black Te once more, ready to march against a red-handed king who rules a mountain keep? He hummed, reaching up to rub one steel hand against his stubbled chin. Cold and heavy, a familiar and comfortable thing. Unlikely. It seems our lord is quite charmed with their high priestess and her bountiful tracts of land. Veteran Struan grumbled out with equal amusement, helm on his belt-hook. Alas, the imperial truth needs revisions, it seems. Enough of that, Struan. Let's not speak ill of our Lord Emperor. It's not often he meets a woman nearing his stature. Veteran Roar reprimanded, a smile audible in his voice and behind his helm. I'm simply grateful these Xenos don't stink of burning trash heaps. I am not so tolerant of wretched smells as ye are. Speak not ill of the pit-born. They're good-natured sorts behind those squinting eyes and inked features. Struan responded, speaking of his occasional visits to gamble his pay away among the 8th Legion. That does little to change their smell, came the dry response from Macduff. Struan nodded his head back and forth, conceding the point. When the Emperor commands us to march, we will march. Duquesne finally spoke, bringing his honor guard to silence once more. When he does not command us to march, we shall not march. This has been truth on Terra, on Baal, on Barbarous. It is no different here, upon Baston. They are Xenos, but our allegiance is not to words, it is to him, and he has not bid us to attack. Satisfied nods abound, his honor guard accepting his words and authority without qualms. He checked his helm's display for any new alerts delivered unto them, and saw nothing but the standing orders to remain on tentative standby for potential hostilities. In the meantime, I suppose we shall continue our observations. Struan responded. Aye. Duquesne responded. Supposedly, the Xenos are hosting something of an open forum for those wishing to hear the words of their oldest war construct. We shall attend to observe. Something like that was announced, wasn't it? Ruar rubbed his chin in consideration. Some manner of necromancy, an old soul animating one of their war walkers, according to 3rd Legion gossip. It reminds me of our war coffins in a queer sorcerer sense. Dreadnoughts, Ruar. The Mechanicum insisted on the updated terminology, if you recall. Macduff responded, Bah, the Mechanicum isn't here to be offended at using the words I know. Ruar responded with gruff agitation. But their machine god is, supposedly. Struan responded, tapping at his own iron hand, another thing amputated in the aftermath of Barbarous. I'm quite confident the Lord Emperor doesn't care what words we use. Gregor grumbled. You're right, he's too busy on other matters, I'd imagine. Struan responded quickly. 2 great big matters, and how best to grapple with them. A brief round of chuckling issued forth. Duquesne, setting an example for his men, only reacted with a quirk to his lips. The Everqueen, Bessel of Ishik. She was, after several days of observation, quite confident in her initial assessment. The Emperor of Mankind, father of the godlings that had allied themselves to her little kin, had some of the most beautiful eyes she had ever seen. Her initial flattery had been a useful opener on her end, both to judge the nigh Ashuriani near God's reaction and as a display of matched strength on her end. He had arrived with the song of his soul, mighty and loud, overpowering all lesser songs in his vicinity, drowning out daemons in waves of gold. She, however, was undaunted. Her song was mighty enough to see through the light of his soul, to look upon the face behind the song. She was no lesser him, and she beheld eyes deep and filled with Ishan tones, bright and burning deep blue behind that crown of gold he forced onto his brow. The reaction he had to her flattery was as tragic as it was complimentary. A moment of naked confusion in those blue eyes, as if what he had heard was utterly beyond reasonable truth, and he needed a moment more to confirm what he had just heard. A basic appreciation for his gorgeous eyes being utterly alien to him. Then another moment to process the statement and look upon her. Then yet another moment to begin a measured response. He had complimented her figure. Almost a blunt observation more than returned flattery, voice filled with rusty tones behind golden fire. Eyes narrowed with concentration. She had 2 thoughts at that moment. Her first being a quiet delight at being seen as a woman rather than an idol for the first time in many ages. The second being that it had been a very long time since the blue-eyed godfather had to return a simple compliment rather than an official praise. Several days followed as the diplomacies were held, and she acted as a proper host, much to her littlekin's humorous panics to the foreign king. She had done this many times before. She was well practiced at acting as an upright lady. This was what she had been raised to do. She needed not any advice from a swaddling babe to entertain a young king. In that time, slowly working away at the hot-cold gold around the man, she had come to a rather sad conclusion. He was long-lived, as the eld of her days were. His kind was not. Living mayfly lives of perhaps a century naturally. The one who called himself the Emperor was an incredibly lonely young man. Your daughters approached me the other day, did you know? She asked, cup of ambrosia in hand, as she stood on the balcony of the Baston High Keep. It was a rather cute construction, a little castle worked into a terrestrial mountain to overlook some of the surrounding lands for a lan or two. They had a request to arrange a meeting with one of my honor guards, with blue-clad Malwan. The Emperor paused in reading one of the many letters that the godling king had left for him, looking up with a quirked brow behind golden radiance. He was not currently wearing his armor, having since taken up his less martial garb of whites and reds, a man who foresaw great violence in his future. Though his personal guard was still arrayed around him, a dozen golden-clad warriors, each almost as tall as an eld of her time was, and bodies bearing the evidence of hand sculpting to refit them to their souls. They were not the greatest example of fleshcraft she had ever seen, but the work bore such a unique set of design elements coming from an expert sculptor who had no tutor. Each was quite the enthralling experience to look upon in its similarity, yet strangeness. Did they? The Emperor rumbled out in a measured manner, taking the offered glass of ambrosia. His blue eyes swirled with blacks and greens. He did not trust her, or any of her people, not yet. She would need to charm him patiently to secure that. I suppose it would have been Morrigan and Fulgrim then, who viewed the theatre of your people yesterday. She knew that he was currently keeping an eye on each of his daughters, for they were well within his domain of sunfire truth. She did not contest this domain. That would most likely scare him away, and she would lose her catch. Instead, she indulged herself in the strange but thrilling experience of being utterly encompassed by the soul of another. Indeed. I have a proposal, if you would hear it for your final day on this world. For he had been quite explicit on his plans to travel southwards, to bring his daughters with him for that leg of the trip, and interact with them independent of all her people. He was currently taking measure of them through distant observation of their souls, but would want direct meetings soon enough. This was the last day he planned to spend here, to give his soldiers a brief holiday. She had yet to secure her catch. Speak, he commanded, arrogant in the manner only youthful kings could be, not yet wearied by eons of withering rule. It would be much too disruptive to join that open forum, the chance for others to speak and question Malwyn. She spoke coyly, fluttering her ears and rolling her shoulders in a manner that caught his eyes. Leaning forwards with childish silver, she gave a performance whisper. So while they speak to my honor guard, let us go in guise elsewhere. His eyes narrowed in black hues. Where? Where? Her eyes twinkled, and she pointed 2 fingers up. Fishing. Fishing. He blinked, befuddled for a moment. She continued her explanation. The oceans of this world's frozen north bear a mighty predator serpent, lindworms, the locals name them. I propose we hunt one together. He spoke in faint, dry amusement. And you are a hunter. She smiled in a wide manner, tilting her chin upwards. No, but I am a fair fisher. I spent much of my youth catching shelled fish along a riverbank, you know. He looked at her for a long moment, then raised the glass of ambrosia in amusement and sipping at the offering. I shall have to make my own judgment of that. Ready yourself for departure this evening. You shall lead me to these predator serpents. Shall any of your guard be with you? Nay? She spoke, amusing herself in the strangled cough beyond the doorway, from her little kin panicking. The Emperor looked up to stare at her for another, longer moment, before squinting and nodding. Very well. My custodians will likewise remain then. He had taken the bait. Now merely to reel him in. 4 was safe and well, wide and lidless eye, mounted atop an unshakable steel pillar soul, drawn from his recent days among Terra itself, in which he beheld the ruins of what was once his most venerable homeland. So much lost, so much wasted, and so many things to rebuild. Setting his arms to the task, he was again and again failed by what he had built, ruined in mere months or years when he looked away from them. Unto Petra, he gave a craftsman's soul. A love of ordered things, of planning and coordination. A soul brimming with wisdom and designs, and the clever hands to realize these designs. A last gift he gave, the lidless eye, which would see those most weak elements of her work long before he often did. She was somewhat more choleric than he was expecting, but she was not tormented. She was healthy, she was productive, and she was sound-minded. She was already doing exactly what he had intended for her, and doing it most excellently. He had heard of her work from his custodians, and the letters left for him. He couldn't be more satisfied with how she had grown in his absence. Come, Falalalale, Liti too, come visit my valley, sang a melodic voice above and in front of him. He continued to push through the thick snow layer with ease, legs as immense ploughs in cutting a path through the frozen water. 8 was safe and well, pale and scale weighing and sword-holding, drawn from the late days of his first kingship, where the crown wore heavy atop his brow, but his sword only grew lighter with time. The judge and executioner meant to look impartially about the world and see truth between lies of snivelling courtiers and snake-tongued nobility, a task that grew easier and easier for him in time, as he grew wiser and wiser with time. Unto Cassandra, he gave the gift of foresight. Waiting for milk-skinned petitioners to get to the point was the single most loathsome experience that a judge must endure. He despised it. He had no curse sufficient enough to express his disdain. Being able to look ahead and sentence them immediately would be something that would make the whole ordeal far more bearable. It was something that she had taken to well in his absence. She was quiet and observant, but firm, and her prowess in the sandy ring was magnificent, able to spar with several of her best-trained sisters simultaneously. He would have to give them some more pointers to keep up. Cassandra had truly become a fearsome warrior in his absence. He was most proud of her. "Come, fa-la-la-la-lee, under the blooming holly," the voice continued to sing, a gentle and happy tune as the journey through the frozen north continued. No winds currently blowing in a world of frozen white, a world that reminded him of his ancient birthland, were it not for how bright it was. 14. He was quite glad to see 14 healthy and whole after seeing the state of the world she had landed upon. A world fallen into green-sick rot magics and daemons of decay abound. He had lost entirely too many men against that world, even if none of his armies saw it in such a manner. To them, they had marched against an unknowable foe, a corrupted world of witch monsters, and had left behind sanctified ash. They were already writing songs about it. Such songs seemed bitter to him over the graves of so many lost to a single world. He would need to improve his stratagems against such places. 14. Morrigan was here, though, safe and whole and melancholic. She had been wrought of his memories of a warrior woman he once knew, although the name long escaped him. A queen of shadows and cold, witch and warrior both. Mankind had no gods, and no safe realm for their souls to travel. The best he could do with such little time was gentle annihilation. He knew he could do far better, had he the hours and wealth to work unobstructed. Morrigan was to assist him in such a grand task, soul well suited to weaving shadows. That dream was distant, though, and so she was given the gift of endurance, to last until such a gentle place could be wrought. We hate to impose. So lonely do we leet. The gentle song continued, and finally he looked up to the singer, pulled from his musings. His initial assessment of the Xeno-priestess was quite accurate. She was beautiful in form, ideal in all proportions, and clad in accentuating garments and decorations. Of her flesh, only her great scale and long, flickering ears gave away Xeno nature, otherwise nigh identical to what he imagined a master-crafted sculpture of painted marble would appear as. Her soul was quite a separate matter. Human souls did not look like this. There was a still lake where her soul might have been, but this was not her soul. Within the glass clear reflection of this lake, where her soul should be, he could see a reflection in its midst. There was a spear there made of glass, made of rainbow scales, scattering light into many hues through the waters, ever shedding scales which fell like droplets into a cup built into the spear tip itself. But this spear existed only in the reflection of the lake, and when he looked above the water to where it should hang, he saw nothing. We're sure you understand. We'd hate to say goodbye. Arms stretched wide, teetering as if balancing on the edge of a humble fence, the Xeno-priestess stepped on top of the snow as if it was solid earth, feet barely leaving footsteps. He huffed in an unamused manner, staring at the back of her head as he pushed through the meter of snow without much effort. She turned back to him, now walking backwards and smiling at him. "Oh, are you bothered by our singing? We admit to being somewhat out of practice." To emphasize her point, she brought her hands down to clasp behind her back, rocking her shoulders back and forth in an apologetic manner. This did interesting things to her bust, which he noted idly. From the mischievous look in her eyes, she was well aware of this. Continuing the charade, he responded as if he had not noticed. "I'm beginning to consider that there are no such serpents to hunt, and that you have lured me out here for nefarious designs." She laughed lightly, a more open expression than he had seen from the vast majority of her people. For the most part, the Exodites seemed far more reserved than their dark eldar kin. He once again felt a spark of amusement at that name. Urbanite was a simple descriptor, but to hear they had apparently taken up the name Dark Eldar was quite amusing. 1,001 potential titles to use, and they decide on something so basic. He had to thank the next one he saw for the good humour they brought before mounting its head on a stake. "Nay, we have no tongue for lies," she boasted, chin tilted towards the sky and back straightened out. They should be in the midst of their mating season now, males displaying their great crests in breeding fields beyond the next mountain range. "We shall find the largest and make a fine meal of it." He hummed in consideration for a moment, thinking on the matter. How large do these beasts grow? She tilted her head to the side and spun briefly as she walked, before answering after a short time. "Perhaps 1 lan at their largest. Their forms cannot support larger flesh than that." "And a lan is?" "Water in your tongue. We use it to measure many terrestrial lengths. From here it would reach the horizon and a few finger lengths further." He looked out to the horizon and ran figures in his mind for a few moments. Roughly 3 kilometers then. He frowned as he considered that. That was quite a large serpent. "There will be a great deal left over," he eventually responded, not just in bulk, but he wasn't the greatest connoisseur of serpent flesh. "I suppose it shall have to be brought back, or the other serpents will devour it." "Little is wasted in cold waters," she responded, unconcerned. "We will eat our fill, others will do the same, and the bones will sink to the depths below and become shelter for all the little lives down there." The reasoning was good enough, he supposed. Instead, he grunted and kept striding through the thick layer of snow onwards, aimed squarely at the next mountain pass in the distance. His first proper evaluations of his supposed son's direct rule were promising. He could detect no sign of malign influence anywhere, save perhaps the abundance of Xenos, and the letters were quite thorough in detailing exactly what he had done and his reasoning for each action. This was both a boon and a curse. A boon because he had precise records to go off of. A curse because they have taken up entirely too much time to read through years of backlogged penmanship. It was always polite, formal, with the bleeding undercurrent of warmth for his sisters each time they were mentioned. The letters were also helpful in telling him exactly what had been done to 17. He almost regretted not destroying the planet entirely rather than just leaving it lifeless. There were always hints of emotion bleeding through the dry and impassive wording on each of the thick wax-sealed letters provided. Save for one subject in particular, himself. Every passage that mentioned him was exactingly neutral, perfectly and carefully devoid of emotion, nothing to indicate the tone used to write left in the letters. That could indicate many things: grief, anger, concealed joy, guilt, countless variations of why the tone was so empty when it came to himself. That alone was reason to pause and consider everything around him. His supposed son had come back, supposedly to set right what went so disastrously wrong. His daughters scattered, their empire ruined, and 10,000 years of suffering to follow. For a moment his mind went back to Barbarous and the words of the Eldar. Set right what went wrong, a retrieval from several locations, most reeking of malign demon worship. He considered the very real possibility that several of his daughters had been corrupted by the circumstances of their homeworlds. It would fit well with the details he had thus far established, and a race to remove them as quickly as possible would also align with such. His daughters were handcrafted by him. He knew their potential. If any being could cause such ruin for the galaxy, it would be his daughters. The only question would be why he hasn't slain them in that once future. He considered that again, what it would take to strike one of them down in that manner. He wasn't sure if he could bear the thought, which may explain the reason for his supposed son's creation. 13th iteration of 0. An executioner to do what he couldn't bring himself to do. A tool wrought with the intention of using it to strike down his daughters. Not just one, by the implication, the 13th of who knows how many. Assuming one for each daughter, his fist clenched. His eyes narrowed. How utterly! The ice cracked below his feet. He blinked and looked down. The snow around him turned to hot slush and quickly melted further with his rage. He shifted his weight to move off. The feeling quite unimpressed with himself, the Emperor fell straight through the ice and into the polar sea below. The Xeno-priestess wouldn't stop giggling at him, pretending to hide it behind her hands and curtain of hair. Feeling vindictive, he shook his head roughly about and scattered water all around himself with whipping hair. Unfortunately, the water did little but encourage her giggling. He glared for a moment behind wet hair and continued on, wet robes now tied tightly around his waist and freeing his upper body. "Hee! No, don't stomp off now, we don't mean to offend," she called after him, a smile still audible in her voice. Quick footsteps brought her up and towards him once more, still stepping atop the snow as if she weighed nothing. "Our laughter is surely unrelated to your misfortune. I thought you had no tongue for lies, Xeno-sorceress," he officially replied, ploughing forwards through the snow without pause. "Of course not. A supposition is surely not a lie. Merely a reasonable assumption on our part," she replied with merriment, teetering after him. "Our merriment is solely in the time spent with you." He raised a brow, looking down in an impassive manner at her. A wet strand of hair fell down to smack against his face. She stared impassively back for a time, before breaking down into giggles once more. He snorted and continued onwards. "We've heard that sickness is common for humans who are cold and wet," she mused aloud. "Shall we divest you of your sodden garments? That will leave me nude." She nodded. "Worry not, we are only concerned with your health. It would not do for you to fall ill in our care." "In your care?" He raised both brows at this, looking at her again as he began to move up. They were just not reaching the most distant foothills of the mountain pass. "You would leave me nude in the frozen north." "Ah, a most troublesome affair indeed." She pretended to consider this. "We shall have to warm you with vigorous activity. You are not the first sorceress to attempt seducing me." He waved off the hidden words, having little need for them while so far from listeners. "Excellent. A trodden path is easier to travel," she replied quickly. "The question is why," he replied lightly, idly. "The moment your people prove to be like all other kinds I'm already familiar with, I will crush your armies, raze your cities, and hear the lamentations for 100 ages. I have little cause to believe your faction is any different from the ones that tormented my kind and caused thousands of years of suffering for everything in the galaxy through proxy of a grand and most foul ritual." She was silent for a moment, allowing him easy time to continue. "My foremost concern is mankind. I have not the heart to bathe in the lambency of federated suns, of man and Xeno united once more, of brighter eras of peace and progress. I dwelt long in that era, and that era was strangled to death by your self-shattered empire." Looking straight ahead once more, brow-heavy with long-waited concerns, he finished. "I have no reason to trust you or your kind. Not with so many atrocities your kin have a direct hand in. My sword is stayed only until your people prove to be yet another enemy. Your attempts to seduce me are likely to sway me from my potential judgment, I suppose." There was silence for a long time before the Xeno-sorceress sighed mournfully. His heart demanded he reach out and comfort her. His mind knew that his heart was a damned fool that was best ignored. He did not bother looking at her expression as she began to reply. "Speaking in the most practical manner, yes. We are attempting to seduce you to secure your aid for our little kin. Our pantheon shattered or devoured or lost or captured. Our empire broken. Our homeworlds consumed, our souls gnawed at. Our urbanite kin, those who wrought the pleasure cults and birthed She Who Thirsts, have descended into a form of despairing madness. Indulgence in excess as a final pleasure before true death. Our trade fleets are scattered and fearful, wandering routes collapsing into chaos. Our exodites, who have utterly rejected the pleasure cults of the urbanites and escaped to distant maiden worlds, are disparate and disorganized. Our last military force is warring against the endless twisting of Sha'el and all the daemons it can belch forth through the womb of destruction, all to keep it from expanding for just a little longer. And were it not for your son, Hopebringer, not even this would be possible. Were it not for him, his rallying declaration, and his actions to save both our peoples, my little kin would likely be doomed to extinction, and I would still be slumbering in my escape vessel, locked in endless stasis by its mechanisms. They would be doomed," she choked out. "What kind of mother can do anything but everything to save her children?" That was something he understood quite well. He glanced over at her. Her ears drooped, her expression wrought with sorrow and twisting. He frowned to himself, looking away and staying on his path. "Why not seek to seduce my supposed son, then?" She gave a choked snort, then escalated into a brief laughter as she wiped away at her eyes. "Your son is quite precocious, a very serious young man." He narrowed his eyes as he rolled that statement over in his mind. He was too young for her to consider a relationship then? Or was it a matter of his demeanour? Moreover, little Muriel is head over heels for him, and they will be quite adorable together. Her ears fluttered happily. Ah, his maid? She was doing that thing women folk tend to do, where they pair young together for romantic scenarios. She nodded happily. She's much too shy to directly state her intentions, and he's much too focused on his labours to eat without a plate being set before him, much less notice her signs of affection. We eagerly await the day he realizes he's too dutiful to let a thing such as that go unaddressed. He filed the information away and returned to the subject at hand. "So you are attempting to seduce me to secure an alliance, and thus safeguard your people." He was familiar with the strategy, having seen it play out in every variation over thousands of years. "1/3 of our reasoning," she corrected. He rumbled in questioning, and she continued. "Your godling daughters are quite adorable. We wish to mother them relentlessly." He gave a suspicious glance down, only to see her not even paying attention, rolling a finger and continuing to speak. "Petra is very self-critical and doesn't have much confidence in herself. Aurelia takes her devotion to her older brother very seriously, often too far. Morrigan scrubs long enough to scratch her body and needs a second hand to relax in warm waters." Cracking open an eye, she smiled. "And Cassandra doesn't express herself very well. We have decided that they need my help, so we will give it to them. If we seduce you, then our mothering will be far more official." He huffed in amusement. "The third reason." She moved close and pressed up against him. His glare snapped down to her. She looked up at him with half-lidded eyes and an undaunted expression. Smiling coyly, she whispered, "We are a woman, you know." She reached up, resting one hand against his stomach and letting it roam. "What were your words again?" "Our grails overflow?" We were quite pleased to hear that. He glared down for a moment longer, weighing truths in his mind. She had been honest. She had been honest. His daughters were safe, well, and sound of mind. That was far better than he could have feared. They had shown no hostility thus far, and he was more than mighty enough to survive any sorcery she could attempt, long enough to activate the Imperial teleportation array. Grabbing both of her hands with his own, he slammed her into the side of the snow-blanketed mountain and loomed above. The snow began to sizzle and melt with an emotion other than anger. He leaned down and let his frustrated breath wash over her face. She gave out a stuttering gasp and full body wiggle. Oh, no!" She had a breathless smile on her face as she put up token, toying resistance. "Very well," he growled out. He would extend a hand of trust and ready himself for it to be cut off. It had been some time since he had known a woman in any carnal sense. There was always work to be done, there were always matters to attend to, there was always strength to regather. In time, his flesh ceased being something used to live within, and became yet another tool in his arsenal. A biological war walker to carry his psychic power, great arms, and great armor into the front lines. Little more. In time, he had ceased to enjoy his flesh and blood. The age of strife allowed him little in the way of opportunity for such. One mighty brazen hand, large enough to eclipse both of her own with scale, pressed down and pinned her arms above her head. Trunk-like arms, bound in muscle, held her firmly against the quickly melting snow, and the running waters were beginning to soak through her thin white garments. He did not bother overmuch with the pageantry of writhing flesh, only enough to buy him time to remember the steps of this dance. His other hand rested upon her generous hips, and he kneaded his accumulated frustrates into soft and smooth cream meat. "Ah!" the priestess gasped out, valiantly squirming against his firm grip. Her elbows buckled as they instinctively attempted to pull her arms in on herself, and her knees withdrew to guard her exposed torso. Doing so left her exposed, and he brought his own knee up to press firmly against her groin, an action met with a deep shudder and a half-hearted attempt to push his thigh away with her legs. This lasted only until she realized that she had wrapped her legs against one of his in doing so and began to grind against him. With half-lidded eyes, she challenged him. His hand rose to grab hold of silky white garments of masterful manufacture and beautiful design. Contemptuously, he tore them off, revealing her form in all its nubile grandeur. She gasped in delighted outrage and opened her mouth to say something. With a growl of warning, he silenced her with his lips and tongue. An invasion of her upper lips, a battle he had not fought in many millennia. He made up for the lack of experience in recent memory with overwhelming force, tongue forcing its way into her mouth and trampling about. She returned, tongue attempting to rise against his own. With contemptuous force he wrestled with it and directed his attentions elsewhere. His hand, currently continuing its ministrations on her hips, turned its focus upwards towards exposed weaknesses. Her heaving chest, burdened by great mounds, came under assault at once. His calloused hand found its target soon enough, pinching and rolling and squeezing, just firmly enough for the sensation to burn its way into her body. She let out yet more noise of pleased distress. Seeing his path of attack was currently suboptimal, he moved his hand and thumb in practice motion and took hold of her other nipple, two of them pinched between his fingers and firm enough to direct as he desired. He stayed in this position for some time, desperately trying to recall the optimal path forwards, busying the enemy with his tongue and hands. Her burst of greater than normal shuddering alerted him, and his attention turned southwards with renewed clarity of purpose. He pulled away from her mouth, her tongue exhausted and body in a state of constant tremor at this point, and released her teats in turn. She opened eyes a tad in question, feeling him retreat from their entanglement for a moment. Her defenses had grown lax in that moment, and his assault returned with vengeance. His hand came down to tear away her soaked lower garments. Her legs, quaking in the wake of their grinding assault, were easily parted by his strength, and his hand clamped down on her groin. "Fway!" A strangled declaration came from her upper lips as two of his fingers forced their way within. He narrowed his eyes and curled his fingers. Her body quaked. Push, curl, pull. Push, curl, pull. Push, curl, pull. A relentless assault on her lower lips, now deeply slicked and at his mercy. He gave a half grin and pressed his thumb down firmly. She screamed as her womb was pressed down from above. He leaned down and buried his face within her soft, delicate neck, letting his breath wash over her. She leaned in, trying to stabilize herself against his body as she was racked with storms of sensation. He brought his head up and mouth clamped down gently on one of her long, spasming ears. His probing attack was rewarded with the lovely, breathless gasps of his target. As a liar, he played her body, finger presses and firm hands returning exclamations in the wordless language, and indeed the occasional exclamation in a language he did not understand, but presumed to be her native tongue. These he silenced with tongue and deep-chested rumbles. There was no need for words here, and he had no interest in them regardless. He intended to take his fill from her body, and he was long overdue for such indulgences. Reminding himself of his, he pulled slick hands from her sex and reached down. She stared to the sky, chest heaving as she desperately attempted to return air to her lungs, before blinking and refocusing to look down at him. He pushed himself between her thighs, a pillar of flesh breaching between her pillowy legs and settling against her stomach. Her legs squeezed together around him, and her face was flush with desire, hot breath of her own clashing with the cold air in bursts of steam that framed her face. Despite her continued torments at his hands, she looked triumphant, as if achieving a great victory over him. He growled, pulled back and pierced her. Hot, and vice-like, and slick. His eyes closed in focus, and a rebellious grunt came from between his teeth. Her legs came around his hips, feet locking in place behind his back, and he cracked open one eye to glare down at her. She was almost grinning now. He snarled and pushed forwards. Her eyes rolled back and body spasmed as he sheathed himself fully within her. Her stomach flexed with his intrusion, and her hips instinctively worked to roll against him. He pulled back, her deceptively strong legs fighting in all the while, trying to keep him deep within. Then, with only the tip remaining within, he lanced forwards again. Again his assault was met with aftershocks, her half-words and gasps losing coherency as he went to work. Slowly at first, but building momentum as he continued, he thrust into her again and again. The shock of each thrust began from the point of impact, their hips colliding, and rippled through her flesh and body, sending her teats bouncing and hair astray. Each thrust accented by a now consistent rhythm of moans from her lips. Ah, ah, aha. Speed was a fool's goal. The true path to victory was hidden within this succulent rhythm and the pace that came from it. There was no reason he couldn't tip the scales further in his favor, of course. His hand, free for some time, seized her hip once more. She convulsed as he went to work again, squeezing her flesh and thumb, pressing down on her womb from above as he thrust up from below. He rolled his fingers and forced his breathing to steady. It was growing more difficult to restrain himself. Her hot folds clenched down upon him in deliriously pleasing manners. Her moans only accented each rolling tide of sensation. He silenced them with his mouth once more, invading both sets of lips in an effort to distract himself from his own body. He realized too quickly his mistake as she moaned directly into his mouth, the sound now nearly a physical sensation. He rumbled in frustration and relish as he stained her interior white, thrusts continuing without pause for as long as he could manage, hot seed filling her and spilling out with each pump. At a certain point, he realized that one of her arms was up under his, hand firmly against his back and pressing him down against her lovely form, her other hand interlaced with his above her head. He pulled back, long black hair hanging low and surrounding her face, shrouding both of them in its curtain. Her breathing was heavy, her face flushed, her ears swaying, and that damned look of exhausted victory on her face. He growled and pulled back, grabbing her by the hips with both hands and flipping her around. She barely pushed up from the soaked earth in time to look back at him. He forced her face forwards again, taking up a tangle of her hair by the base in one hand, forcing her delightful rear up with the other and thrusting inside again. Her legs resumed their quaking almost immediately, the aftershocks not having left her yet. Ah, ah, ach. Her tunes began quickly again, her body pressed against the earth time and time again as he took her from behind. The impacts once more rippled through her body as their hips collided again and again. He would empty her of any expression of victory, he swore it. San Leor was a planet in the southern galaxy that would go on to become incredibly important in a future that he returned from. The birthplace of the Adepta Sororitas, more commonly known as the Sisters of Battle, military branch of the Ministorum. Technically, the Adepta Sororitas was wider than just their sisters militant, but this wasn't currently relevant. The Orders militant were one of the great armies in service of mankind against the forces of chaos, xenos, and traitors of various stripes. They were fanatical in this aim, and such fanaticism lent itself well to their efforts through unconscious shaping of the warp around them via great amounts of ambient belief. The greatest of these miracles was found in the living saints, people who were filled with enough faith-flavored warp energy to be elevated into almost daemons, who appeared on battlefields where they were needed most and disappeared once the battle was done. There was some more technical explanation involved, but Roboute cared little for it, because he had been struck down soon before the War of the Beast and placed into stasis for 10,000 years. During that time, the Imperium turned from an empire built on reason and clear focus to a crumbling, rotten husk of what it once was. It turned from the imperial truth that there was no need for institutions of superstition and cultish behavior to the imperial faith, the most powerful and widespread cult humanity had ever known. A cult based around the worship of the Emperor's undying corpse, set upon the golden throne, and spirit bound to his bones, lest the forces of chaos wash into the materium in endless numbers. Roboute had very mixed feelings about the imperial faith, most of which were negative, some of which begrudgingly accepting, and one of which was entirely positive. In that era, in which he was constantly forced to manage the manifold inefficiencies and wasted supplies on sheer stupidity, there were a few silver linings to having soldiers who would obey unquestioningly and against any odds he had need of them. He had been expecting the Astartes to be such, and they were for the most part as he had been used to. He hadn't been expecting to see such unquestioning loyalty from other branches of the imperial forces. In the brief century that he commanded them, the utter fanatics and worshipful maniacs that made up the imperial forces, all branches of such, had continually surprised him with their less obvious virtues. Morale breaking was an issue he was forced to handle during the Great Crusade whenever he had to use mortal troopers. It's why he preferred to simply rely on his legion when possible, his Astartes who knew no fear. The rule of thumb was typically 1/3 losses, resulting in morale being broken for a given regiment of mortals. Morale breaking in the once future was a statistical anomaly. He had believed the reports to be manufactured when he first laid eyes upon such, and realized the numbers weren't as he was used to. It was only when he received enough evidence of such that he began to look closer at the mortals he was forced to rely on in all their bickering and worshipping and cultish behavior, all their screams of heresy and superstitions, all their hate and fear. When he commanded them to march, the mortals of the dark future marched until they died. Regiments slaughtered to a man to buy time elsewhere was not only expected of them, but anticipated. Morale in excess even of what he was used to, his legions displaying during the Great Crusade, unflinchingly fighting and dying despite the shoddy condition of everything around him. That unnatural morale was, in no small part, the result of the imperial faith. He had no wish to replicate the imperial faith with all its rotting grandeur and blazing superstitions, but a strong internal propaganda department to replicate even a portion of that unwavering morale would be a great boon to his armies. That morale, with proper tactics and equipment, would give him an incredible military corps. All of that, however, was for long future concerns. Currently, San Leor was simply another feudal world, currently under attack by orcs. Divided into 5 primary continental landmasses, San Leor was another Terra-like world of temperate climate, mild temperature, abundant water, flora and fauna. At least it should be from the scans of the planet. It was currently exiting a global warming period and going into an ice age, but that shouldn't matter for another tens of thousands of years. What was important was that San Leor was significantly more hot and dry than he remembered it being. Currently, one of its major landmasses was smoking, a slowly expanding tide of orcs emerging from the crash landing of one of their crude fleets of asteroid ships. He had wanted to arrive before the orcs landed, but a dark eldar attempted raid in the webway forced them to change course to restock before arriving here. His ships didn't quite have the standards he would want them to yet, all of them hastily repaired salvage from the many derelict shipyards he remembered being found in the Great Crusade. They would be good enough for now, while the primary shipyard systems were being repaired and put back into service after a purgation of the various mutants and xenos that infested them prior. A fleet of hundreds of ships hovered over the world, and Robut decided this would be an excellent learning opportunity for Aurelia, the sister he was most hesitant to let beyond his watchful gaze. Lorgar had never been particularly suited for war, even if Aurelia seemed overall more intrigued by combat than he remembered his brother being. Robut wanted to make sure she could handle herself before she reached her 10th year. Arms crossed, looking down at the world from a tilted flagship bridge, the High King of Albion spoke out. Row after row of his Gina soldiers, his Astartes, stood in attendance slightly below, his second batch of personal trainees listening to him tutoring his sister in the war arts. The first batch was all already working on educating their own batches in the same manner he had educated them. This form of distributed training was required to get Albion off the ground in a reasonable time frame. Aurelia, what are the strategic and tactical considerations when facing orcs? His sister had remained mostly unchanged from the day he retrieved her, only growing slightly in scale and frame in the past few years. Currently, she was perhaps a handful of inches short of 9 feet, and he didn't expect her to exceed that benchmark by much, if at all. She was roughly eye level with his sternum, on par with Petra and Cassandra. This lined up with how tall he remembered his corresponding brothers being in rough estimate. Aurelia, clad in her own power mail plated with wraithbone, studiously answered him. Orcs are a xenospecies that functions as an invasive ecosystem, with the eponymous orcs actually only serving as the endpoint of their biological hierarchy. When any orcoid dies, they release fungal spores that can grow in 9/10 of all known environments that can support life. These spores, in turn, grow into the various orcoids, starting with squigs, then snots, then grots, then orcs. These orcoids contain all facets of an ecosystem in a self-contained system and are ruinous to existing ecosystems. It is vital to ensure these spores are destroyed to prevent orcoids from simply rising again within a few decades or centuries, with complete exterminations difficult but not impossible. The primary consideration when facing orcs is the subtle but potent effects of their latent psychery, a field that is naturally generated by each orc and works in tandem with fields from other orcs to passively aid them in their objectives. This wave field attempts to warp local materium in their subconscious favor, machines functioning better than they should, incidents of chance going in their favor more often than not, a resistance to external warp effects and enemy psychery, and so on. Understanding the common mimetic beliefs of the orcs will allow one to predict what these passive warp effects will entail. Orcs are led by a warboss, the largest and strongest orc in any present group. Warbosses are determined through constant in-group competition, and when a warboss is defeated, orcs will often collapse into in-group competition to determine the next warboss. This is because the warboss serves as the linchpin that any given wave field typically revolves around, and his death will significantly weaken the orcs until a new warboss is determined. Aurelia paused for a moment, considering it further. There are several subtypes of orcs that develop vital talents to aid in the function of the overall group. Medica, Technician, and Active Psyker are the most easily confirmed variants. It is not confirmed where these subtypes gain their specialist knowledge, but it is suspected to be biologically ingrained. There are also several subgroups and internal factions of orc, and determining which one you face will often aid in determining what tactics should be used against it. Indeed. He smiled and nodded. Now the orc asteroid vessel has just recently landed. Knowing this and knowing what forces we have available, what would you do in order to destroy the orcs? She looked at the planet, then down to the strategic display from planetary scans, and started to evaluate the state of things. Her lips pushed together in thought as she took in the relevant information. He allowed her the silence and time to think. Much better a plan you had time to consider than a plan that was rushed, and this was her final test in this regard that he would be giving her. The war greatly increases chances of survival when chance is a factor. This is well known and observable. Artillery, while normally effective with orbital superiority, almost always performs significantly worse against orcs while their way is in full strength. In order to ensure the success of our orbital weapons, we must either cause undue damage to the world or break the strength of the war by slaying the warboss. Only the most durable orcs survive the landing of their asteroid ships, which would include the warboss. She leaned forwards and pointed at the asteroid ship impact zone. First, I would petition our eldar allies to quarantine the airspace around the impact site using their psychery to prevent any spores from spreading, with our own aircraft acting as support against potential orc flyers. While this is occurring, the civilian population of the impact site would be evacuated and decontaminated, while ground-level quarantines and firing lines are set up to prevent expansion of the orc war. Once the warboss is located, a decapitation strike force would be launched to execute him, with the killing field pushing forwards to execute the orcs as they fight amongst themselves. "Are you confident in this answer?" he asked her neutrally, not letting his tone indicate whether he agreed with it or not. She went over the plan again mentally, before looking up and firmly declaring, "Yes," Reboot smiled. "It is a good answer," he responded, to which Aurelia beamed up at him. He continued to speak. "There are technologies that can act to clear the environment of orc spores, but currently we don't have access to them. The pattern will have to be retrieved or reverse-engineered at some point. For now, the psychery of our eldar allies is more than sufficient. They have grown quite practiced in the art of dealing with orcs specifically." Himself now leaning over the strategic display, he pointed down and questioned again. Now, looking at the map, where would you order the quarantines to be established? Aurelia considered it for a moment more before pointing. The orcs have landed in a rather dry region, surrounded by mountains, cutting off easy access to the rest of the planet, with two areas to leave from. A more narrow section to the northeast, and an open stretch of plains and grasslands to the southwest. I'd concentrate most of our artillery and aircraft in the... She glanced over to the part of the display that measured distances. Few thousand miles of open plains, while establishing bunkers and fortifications in the much more narrow northeast, with secondary line fortifications being established as a fallback point across the second row of the encircling mountain range. Reboot found it difficult to worry too much about Aurelia's future as a commander. He was rather confident in her. Smile firmly on his face at this point, he continued his testing of her tactical ability for a good half hour. He had already given the order to get ready for surface deployment. They would need time to get everything ready. In the meantime, he could make sure his sister would do fine without him. He planned on breaking this primary fleet apart once it was up to his standards. The current battle fleet, the First Albion Fleet, a name Asarnil had groaned at when he first named it, revolved around the 12-kilometer command carrier, the Star Dragon, found within shipyard system Endragiga and quickly brought to repair to serve this purpose. He planned on dividing his military into more standard units, similar to the chapter system for Astartes that he first devised several hundred years ago, but more general. 1,000 soldiers, even if they were Astartes, was far too few per group. He had underestimated how tumultuous the galaxy and Imperium would grow without he or his brothers there to lead them. 10,000 Astartes might make a more reasonable subset, but the chain of command with regular troopers will be muddied and lead to conflicts of command. He had seen such happen to ruinous effect in the dark future. He was going to take steps to avoid that with a unified chain of command. A group of perhaps 100,000? No, at least 1 million soldiers and everything that they would need in an active crusading fleet. Internal logistics, armored vehicles, aircraft, voidcraft, and elsewise. He was thinking of calling them General Operations Battle Groups, or GOBs for short. He hadn't worked out all the details yet. The name was functional for theoreticals for now. Currently, however, he had one primary fleet and several dozen worlds sworn to him being developed. If his schedule stayed consistent, the first GOBs would be established within the next 5 years. Frowning, and pretending that his frown was directed at the orcs below, he decided that he really needed to work on his naming sense. "Arik, Kaitan," he called out, bringing the attention of the two men to him. One clad in bronze, the other in gold, and both in red. Arik had recovered tremendously from his initial state, now free of any shakes or injuries, and clad in the best weapons Roboute could manage, as were all of the Thunder Warriors. Wraithbone painted bronze and chiseled in whatever symbols the venerable warriors wished to take up, they had eventually settled on a split-face banner, one bearing a bird of prey backed by 4 bolts of lightning, the other bearing a sun impaled by a sword. Thunder Warriors, Star Slayers, and his mightiest warriors. They had doubled in number, the rookies drawn from various soldiers under his banners that had potential, and elevated into newfound biochemical power. Said rookies were not permitted to bear the bird of prey and its 4 lightning bolts, only the stabbed sun. Kaitan, continuing his duty but not technically under Reboote's command, had taken it upon himself to act as custodian for Arik until the Emperor recalled him to his side once more. "Aye, Lord," Arik replied, speaking in the same lax manner that he had first met Reboot with, now with the undercurrent of respect in his tone. "It will take time to evacuate the cities, and my main forces will need time to deploy. I need you to lead the Orc front on a chase to tie them up while they work. You do not need to engage, simply keep them from advancing." He did not bother to ask if Arik would reject this order, or if he thought he and his fellows were capable of this. It was quite obvious what the answers for both questions were already. Not fight, and miss out on making a nice green wall? Arik commented with murderous humour, reaching up to scratch his chin as he looked upon the world from above. "About how many will there be again, and how many hours do you need? Assume endless, and at least 12. Arik grunted in consideration, before leaning forwards and pointing at a spot. "Send us down here first, and have one of them pointy-ear teams ready to send us across the front as we need. We don't have any of those fancy jet bikes yet. Anything else? Have them ready to push ammo through when we ask too. We'll probably need that." Arik reached down to put on his helmet again, the seal hissing shut as the mask slid over his face. His helmet was elaborately designed, bearing the cast metal form of a grinning, monstrous face and an elaborate plume of blood red. "Drinks too, we'll get thirsty from all the hard work you're having us do." Reboot smiled. "Any particular kind? The cheapest and shittiest beer you got. The boys have been taking all my pay when we play dice, so I need to remind them who's in charge." Arik grumbled with good humor. Kaitan commented on this, smooth voice calling through his own powered helm and auramite armor. His gunglaive hefted over his pauldron, and other hand on his hip. It wouldn't be an issue if you simply stopped going all in every time. Arik gave an exaggerated huff of frustration. "Not go all in," he says. "This is why we call you Stuffy, you know. Malum Kaido doesn't call me Stuffy." Kaitan responded calmly. "The Big Blue King doesn't count. He doesn't call anyone Stuffy, even when he rightly should," Arik quipped back. Robot snorted in good humor and waved them off, letting the two men walk out of the bridge and ready themselves for another deployment. Looking at yet another world being attacked by orcs, Robot inhaled and exhaled before reaching down and taking up his helmet. The third in a mere decade, he was going through armor entirely too fast. The first lost to chaos magic, granted, but the other two simply didn't fit his growing frame any longer. Fortunately, he had capped at his new and inconvenient height, and he hasn't needed to commission yet another set of armor since. The overall design of the helm was similar to before. A skull mask integrated into a sloped armored helm and bevel, decorated with a golden laurel wreath and bladed crest. The bevel was another feature he'd like to integrate into the standard power armor designs of his empire. It housed the force field generator that acted similarly to the iron halos, but not quite as effectively. This was more of a mass production pattern. He had no particular reason to be staring at the skull face for as long as he was. He raised the helm and donned it once more, his armor hissing as the void suit layer sealed close again. Robot let a grim smile overtake his face. Time to convince feudal humans that they needed to evacuate their cities in an orderly fashion towards a wall of guns and away from invading Xenos. Again, it was always more of a hassle than it really should be.